Welcome back to CineSnap. Today, we're diving into an Italian romantic drama film filled with desire, heartbreak, and the struggles of a woman in a judgmental society. Warning, spoilers ahead, stay tuned till the end for a powerful conclusion. A 13-year-old boy, Renato from Casteltuoto, Italy, recalls a day when Mussolini is giving a speech to the nation and declaring war on France and Britain. On the same day, Renato is receiving his first bicycle. As Mussolini's declaration plays through speakers all over the city, Renato excitedly writes back to his friends. When he arrives, they are praising his new bicycle and then sit on the side, fascinatedly watching Malena walk on the street. Malena is the daughter of the Latin teacher, Professor Bonsignor, and when she passes by them, the group often speeds away on their bicycles, trying to keep their eyes on her. Renato is admiring her beauty and watches her intently whenever he gets the chance. Afterward, the group of friends is heading to their Latin class. Renato spends the day in contemplation, still in awe of Malena's beauty. The next day, the group of friends is hanging out at the edge of a cliff, discussing Malena and assessing their manliness. A friend of Renato mentions his encounter with Malena, which angers Renato and prompts him to make fun of his friend. Later, Renato is skipping school and riding to Malena's house where he daydreams about her, shouts at him, and asks for a cigarette. However, when he gazes at Malena's house with the door closed, his daydream is interrupted. At home, his father is angry at him for skipping school, being laughed at by friends, and his pants being altered. Later that night, Renato sneaks out of his room and visits Malena's house again. He climbs a tree, looks inside through a hole in the window, and sees Malena lying on the couch. Out of curiosity, he watches Malena moving around, listens to the radio, then discovers a photo of her husband, Nino Scotia. The next day, in a barber shop, the men inside are discussing Malena and how she came to their town through Nino, who is currently fighting in the war. When Renato's number is called, he complains to the barber, asking why he can't sit in the adult's chair. Of course, the barber just tells him he is too young. After the haircut, Renato returns to Malena's house, watches her with a telescope, sees her drying herself next to the garden. Later, Renato climbs to the window and peeps at her working with a sewing machine through a hole. As Renato watches, he is surprised to see Malena's skirt slightly slipping off, revealing part of her body. Later, she begins to dance with Nino's photo in her hand. A song is playing in the background until she returns to the room. The next morning, Renato goes to a music store asking for a copy of the song playing in Malena's house. Once he gets home, he is playing the song while looking at pictures of female bodies. When he falls asleep, he imagines that they all are Malena. The next day, Renato goes back to the cliff where he and his friends often hang out. He is trying to write a letter to Malena. There, he claims that he does not listen to the town's rumors. He is the only man after her husband. Renato then rejoins his friends who are eagerly looking for Malena. Then he makes up an excuse and leaves his friends before catching up with Malena. When he sees her, the men in town are watching her walk on the road. The men greet her, but she just keeps walking, staring blankly at the ground. A man greets her, repeatedly kissing her hand. The other men are watching jealously. Malena gazes at Lieutenant Cady, standing next to the balcony, then quickly shifts her gaze from him. When she reaches her destination, Renato sees her reaching for the keys to the apartment door. Later in Latin class, some students make rude jokes about Malena, which disgusts Renato. As the students leave, Renato watches them down the stairs and spits at them. After this, Renato goes to the mechanic to fix his bicycle. From there, he spots Malena again. Renato can only watch her while the women in town are disgusted by Malena's presence. One of the women compares her to a town escort, Gina. Malena goes to the apartment again with Renato still following her. He climbs a nearby gate to see who Malena is looking at and reveals it's her father. Later in the evening, Renato is at home touching himself while listening to the song again, all the while thinking about Malena. The next day, During the morning workout, a friend of Renato tells him that Nino's courtier died in combat. Later, Renato attends a funeral for Nino. At the memorial, two girls stare at Lieutenant Cady, talking about how handsome he is, and they feel dizzy. After leaving, Renato goes back to Professor Bonsignor's apartment, sees Malena lying on the bed, crying sadly for her lost husband. In Renato's imagination, he walks up to Malena, comforts her, and promises her that he will be by her side before Malena embraces him. Later, in Nino's funeral procession, Malena poses as the Virgin Mary, looking dreadful while the very concerned Renato watches her from below. After the parade, he accidentally overhears some townspeople gossiping about Malena again, slandering her, which angers Renato and prompts him to spit in their drinks and urinate in their bags. Renato goes to a church praying to a saint, asking him to protect Malena from the harm of the townspeople. After leaving the theater, Renato steps out and he quickly discovers that Malena has left a shop. The men in the shop rudely talk about her, and when Renato unintentionally overhears, he throws a stone at the shop, shattering the window and then rides away. Later, Renato sits near Malena's house as a battalion of German soldiers walks by. When Malena enters her home, Renato goes to the yard, grabs one of her panties, and then runs back to his bicycle to go home. Back in his room, Renato touches himself, again holding Malena's panties close to him, imagining the two of them together until he falls asleep. The next day, Renato's father walks into Renato's room, finds Renato sleeping with panties over his head. His father is furious, tells Renato he is ashamed of him, and Renato's other family members follow suit. After Renato's father scolds him, he locks him in the room, and Renato's mother, crying with shame, burns the panties. 3 days pass, and Renato's mother is worried about her son who hasn't eaten. Then she complains about how the fascists are treating them. The next day, a doctor comes to see Renato. He tells the family he needs to go out. Later, Renato rides his bicycle to Malena's house again. The streets are now crowded with people and cars. Once there, he sees Lieutenant Caddy and others staring at Malena's house. As time goes on, Renato is doing a report in class. Suddenly, a man comes in, hands a letter to Professor Bonsignor. In the letter, it is written that the professor is humiliated because his daughter is sleeping with the whole town. Heartbroken, the professor leaves his class and the students can only talk about the letter. Renato feels insulted, fights with one of the students, and imagines himself as Malena's gladiator at the same time. At night, Renato returns to Malena's house, finds Lieutenant Caddy inside talking to her. Renato is enraged by what he sees, especially when Lieutenant Caddy kisses Malena before leaving. On his way out, the lieutenant runs into dentist Dr. Cusimano. The dentist berates him for pursuing Malena, referring to her as his fiancée. Cusimano slaps Lieutenant Caddy first, though Lieutenant Caddy initially refuses to retaliate, but when he is slapped a second time, he fights back. The two are fighting, and before long, Dr. Cusimano's wife arrives with the police. She angrily calls her husband an adulterer, and as the police try to quell this men's quarrel, she goes to Malena's front door, curses her, and tells her to stop stealing husbands from her village. Meanwhile, Renato can only watch with an incredulous expression as the police begin to arrest these two fools. The next day, the townspeople are abuzz about the event of the previous night, arguing over who is to blame. Many are shocked that Malena is reported to have two lovers and mention that the professor has shamefully resigned from his job. They also suggest that Malena should go to court for luring married men. Renato inadvertently hears this news as he passes by, and then he starts looking for Malena again. Back at her father's apartment, Malena tries to open the door, but the key doesn't fit. Renato watches from the side, realizing that the professor has abandoned his daughter. He just stares at Malena, worried. Subsequently, Malena goes to attorney Centerby's office, asks for the lawyer, and then enters the court. In the busy courtroom, Renato watches as Malena stands trial. The judge continues to question Malena about the dentist and the relationship. Malena tells the judge that Dr. Cusimano only visited her once to deliver medicine for her father, and he falsely claimed to be her fiance. When the judge asks about Lieutenant Gaddy, Malena says that their relationship was nothing to do with the law. However, the judge informs Malena that due to this incident, Lieutenant Gaddy was questioned in a judicial investigation before being transferred to Albania. After speaking, he lets his clerk report Lieutenant Caddy's statement. Malena listens disappointedly as the clerk tells everyone that Lieutenant Caddy has a casual view of his relationship with Malena, claiming they are just friends. Then attorney Centerby begins to passionately speak, defending Malena and blaming Dr. Cusimano because he thinks Malena's only fault is her beauty. She just wants to start a new life after her husband's death. When the court is dismissed, Malena and attorney Centerby return to her home. They dance and Renato watches from outside the window. Malena and Centerby chat for a while and then Centerby makes his move on her, telling her the only payment he wants is Malena herself. Renato watches in terror as Centerby forces him close to Malena, trying to make her fall in love with him. For a better view, Renato moves to another tree branch, but the branch breaks and the boy falls down. The next day, Renato returns to the church, talks to the saint, tells him he forgives Malena for what she did last night. Then he tells the saint that he didn't protect Malena, so he breaks the saint's arm to make things even. In class, Renato is still thinking about Malena and he writes her a letter expressing his love for her and that she doesn't deserve a man like Centerby. Renato then imagines his professor as Malena, but he is interrupted when his professor scolds him for doing the wrong activity. Renato rushes out of the classroom, pushes a statue, causing it to fall and break. Afterwards, Renato and his family are at the tailor shop. Renato is trying on trousers that fit him while his father listens to the radio, where there are reports about the continuous bombing by the Allies. After leaving the tailor shop, Renato encounters Centobi, who is visiting his mother. Renato watches as his mother slaps him, laughing and shouting at him, expressing her disapproval of Malena. Afterwards, Renato follows Centobi and finds him with a teary eyed and pitiful Malena, where they end their relationship. This relieves Renato and then he goes to the barber shop. After that, Renato continues to track Malena, who is being harassed by men on the street. She crosses a small alley to evade people's attention and suddenly she slows down. When Renato sees this, he thinks that Malena is walking towards him, so he also slows down. To his disappointment, Malena walks past him and approaches Antonio, a man who gives her food. As Renato watches, he suddenly hears the sound of an engine signaling the arrival of Allied planes and prompts Renato to run to his bike and flee as the Allies start bombing parts of the town. After the bombing, Renato runs towards one of the destroyed buildings where soldiers are dragging the body of Professor Bonsignor. Shortly afterwards, Malena and her father's students attend the professor's funeral. As he is buried, dozens of men line up to pay their condolences to Malena. Renato also lines up but gets interrupted by an older man, and he finally leaves when he sees more men whispering into Malena's ear. After the funeral, Malena returns home, starts cutting hair and doing the dishes while Renato watches helplessly at the door. A car suddenly arrives at Malena's house, causing Renato to hide away. Antonio's friend Salvatore gets out of the car and knocks on Malena's door. After greeting him, she welcomes him in. Through a hole in the window, Renato, tears streaming down his face, watches as Salvatore immediately forces himself on Malena. As Salvatore entertains himself, Malena stares coldly at the ceiling, causing Renato to storm home angrily. The next day, more Germans occupy the town and Renato walks along the street before he sees Malena. He is stunned because Malena now has red hair and wears revealing clothes. As she walks towards a table, the men around her look at her in surprise while the women look at her with disgust. Malena pulls out a cigarette and the men around her give her a lighter. Renato watches disappointedly. The next morning, Renato listens and watches as the men in the barber shop look at Malena, who now has blonde hair. She is escort Gina, and they both serve the Germans there. Because of this, Renato imagines the atrocities that Malena and Gina perform on the Germans in the hotel before he eventually passes out. Renato's parents pick him up from the barber shop and take him to the church where they perform an exorcism on him because his mother thinks he is possessed by the devil. Afterwards, they take him to a house by the sea for a ceremony. Outside, Renato's father cries dismissively, thinking that Renato only needs to sleep with a woman to cure his foolishness. After the ceremony, Renato's father takes him to brothel where Renato carefully selects and then settles down with a dark-haired escort. Then the two go to a room where they start to hook up. Later, the Allies enter the town, freeing Castle Couto from German influence. Renato celebrates, riding joyfully in an American jeep. Suddenly, a group of women rush into a building and drag Malena out. These women start to beat her in the street, tear off her clothes, and publicly humiliate her. Renato is terrified and can do nothing as the women cut her hair, curse her for sleeping with their husbands. When they're done, Malena is left alone, bloody and crying in pain and humiliation before the women chase her out of the town. Shortly after, Renato rides to the train station and sees Malena get on the train. Renato doesn't speak to the woman he desires most and he watches helplessly as she leaves. Sitting on a cliff where he hangs out with his friends, a desolate Renato stares at the record of the song he first heard at Malena's house and throws it off the cliff into the sea. Back in town, a car stops and lets a man out. As he walks down the street, people recognize him and reveal that this man is Nino Scordia, Malena's husband who was believed to have died. Renato follows Nino into his old house and is surprised to find refugees there, and his wife is missing. Renato continues to follow Nino as he enters an American office. There, he tells what has happened to him, and Renato listens on the side. Nino desperately asks the Americans to help him find his wife. Renato is still following him. Nino approaches former government officials and asks them if they know where to find Malena. The officials just laugh, which angers Nino and confronts them. One of them knocks down Nino down and leaves. Renato helps a broken up Nino after which Nino goes back to his own home. Nino sits by the bed contemplating when suddenly Renato throws a letter next to him. Nino tries to chase the boy, but he ends up reading the letter in which he learns that Malena has always been faithful to him and she has gone to Messina. With his discovery, Nino boards a train to Messina with Renato watching on the side. As the days pass, the town returns to its normal life. As Renato is with the girl, everyone suddenly stops to stare at Nino, who is now reunited with his wife Malena, and they both return to Castle Couto. The people of the town can only look at this couple in awe, ignoring everyone as they return home. Later in the market, Malena works with a dozen people staring at her as she goes from one shop to another. Everyone comments. Two women stare at her. Malena turns back to greet them. They welcome her back, and suddenly people in the market start to act normally again, continuing with the daily affairs. After Malena finishes shopping, Renato comes over on his bike, watching as long, fixed women returning home. On her way home, some oranges fall from her bag. Renato gives her a hand. As he puts the oranges back in the bag, his hand touches hers. Finally, he talks to her and wishes her good luck. At this, Malena nods and walks away. As Renato watches her leave, he thinks that despite being with many women, it's only Malena he'll always remember.